Nightmares are usually something that you can wake up and shake off. But somehow, I feel like what happened to me is beyond that. I've been thinking about it on and off for years now, and I can't shake the feeling of his distant stare. In 2012, my house was destroyed in a hurricane, and I had to move into my grandmother's house with both of my parents and our 2 pets, a cat and a dog, as we got our house fixed up. I slept in the bed with my grandma and her 20-something-year-old blind dog, while my parents slept in the room across the hall adjacent to it. I know my grandma's house is spooky sometimes, and I get scared when I have to sleep there. There's always some kind of spooky antic going on. A toilet will randomly flush, or you might feel a slight poke, finger on your skin. But it's usually never more than that. It just seems like a friendly presence, even though it still gives me the heebie-jeebies. That's not exactly the point of me telling this, but maybe it could have something to do with him. One night, my nana and I were watching movies and snacking all night. The third movie we put on was nearing its end, and I grabbed our bowls and bits of candy wrappers to clean up. Walking into the kitchen, the only source of light was the reflection of light from one lamp that was shining on a mirror in the living room. The trash pickup should have been a pretty quick job, being that the can was right near the doorway of the kitchen, and I only had to drop the bowls in the sink. But I was in there for longer than I feel I should have been. I got thirsty, so I went back to get my cup for a refill. My nana was out cold, snoring with her little elderly pup at her side, who was also knocked out. She never makes it through a movie, so I wasn't really surprised. I laughed a bit to myself and went back to get some water from the faucet. The water began to fill my cup. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my leg. I was thinking that it could have been my nana's blind dog, but I remembered he was sleeping with her merely seconds after I brushed it off. I looked down, thinking that it maybe could have been a mouse. Upon further panicked searching, I saw something peering at me from the dark of the sunroom. The whites of its eyes were exposed just enough to see that it was looking directly at me, from eye level with me. I couldn't make out any other feature other than its round eyes. It wasn't like it was in the corner of the room. It was only a few feet away from the doorway to the sunroom that was opposite the doorway to the living room. Now I'm realizing that it wasn't someone or anything familiar to me. I wanted to yell, but it was so late. Everyone was asleep, and this could have just been my sleepy-headed imagination, right? I stumbled back a bit toward the living room's doorway to turn the kitchen light on, but I was either too slow to see what it was, or I was just imagining it. After all, it was pretty late, 2 or 3 a.m, and I was getting very tired. I didn't think of that at the time. I just ran back to the living room with my grandma. She was sitting up, yawning and looking for the remote to turn the television off. I was super freaked out, but I didn't want to scare her, so I helped her and we went to bed. I wish I hadn't fallen asleep that night. I felt like I didn't sleep at all. Laying flat on my back, I stared at the ceiling in the dark, and before you know it, hours later, I was staring at the ceiling in the same spot. I hadn't moved at all. For some reason, I couldn't move anything. I felt like I was having some sort of extreme sleep paralysis, which I've never experienced since this. But no one came to wake me or check on me. I saw my nana from my peripheral get up and get ready for work, but she didn't even look at me. I couldn't even turn my eyes to look at her. Seeing her made this feel more like I was just having an episode of sleep paralysis. I was stuck, fixated on this one spot on the ceiling. This went on and on for hours. The room started to darken again. I couldn't tell if I was really awake or not. These hours felt real. Once nightfall hit, I saw something come into my peripheral vision. It crept up, just out of sight, where I couldn't totally see it. But what I could see were those squirrely-looking eyes. My heart was pounding, and I wanted to cry for help. This went on for 6 more days and nights. Imagine being awake and unable to move for 6 days. Whatever went wrong in my brain caused my dream to feel as if real time was passing, and I was stuck there with an entity that would return every nightfall to watch me sleep. It felt like it was feeding off of my fear. I woke up for real, but it was only the next morning, and I didn't tell anyone of this until now. I know it's not just a dream entity, because I saw it in the sunroom the night before I fell asleep. I haven't seen this thing since, but I don't want to experience its presence ever again. For the vast majority of people who celebrate Christmas, it's a joyous time. Time of year filled with sparkling lights, family, warm fires, and especially homely meals. For me, it means trying not to embarrass my wife in front of her parents, dodging the spray of half-chewed turkey flying from Great Aunt Barbara's mouth as she expresses her opinions, and smiling as I sit through several interrogations about my latest job promotion. It's sort of tradition that at least once a year, someone will have gravy poured into their hair for one reason or another. Having said that, it's not all bad. We always come away with a great story to tell our friends, and I get to see my nieces and nephews. I've always wanted kids, but something about pushing a small watermelon out of her woo-ha is unappealing to my wife. So we won't be having any kids of our own, which means I sort of father over her sister's children instead. Her sister has 5 kids. The youngest is only 18 months old and has a lot to say for a little man who can't talk. Then there's the twins, Haley and Jackie. They're 5 and adorable. The second oldest is Stephanie, and she's 7. She loves it when I magically pull coins out of my nose. And then there's the eldest, Jacob. Jacob is quietly my favourite. He really feels like he's my own son. I think it's because his own father isn't in the picture. Of the 5, he's the odd one out, I suppose you could say. The other 4 are from the same father, my wife's sister's husband. but Jacob's father was a deadbeat that ran off when he was barely a week old. When the family gathers for Christmas, it's usually a week-long event. We all drive, fly or coach in from wherever we are in the country and stay at my wife's parents' ranch. The location is quiet and secluded. The nearest town is nearly a half-hour's drive away. Coming up to it, you see long expanses of snow-covered fields, lined with tall pine forests, and the outline of the ranch looming in the distance. It's really a huge house. We all get our own separate, fully furnished guest rooms. Out the back is a large pond that's, more often than not, on its way to freezing over, and the horse stables. A part of the tradition is that all the men of the family go out there on horseback to pick up a tree and to shoot some poor creature for the Christmas dinner. Always a fun event for someone like me who, A, can't ride a horse, and B, gets nauseous when they start skinning the things they've shot. Thankfully, after the first year's chaos, they now leave the tree gathering to me rather than the animal dismembering. This year, my wife and I were the second to arrive. Her sister's family was already there and greeted us warmly, which meant that we were waiting on her great aunt to show up. Not that anyone would really mind if she didn't. Unfortunately, however, they arrived not too long after us. With everyone accounted for, the festivities began. My father and brother-in-law hunted a deer, while I cut down a nice fluffy Christmas tree. We settled in that night, after a rousing game of family 8-ball, and a little too much eggnog. However, at around 2 a.m, I felt someone pushing at my shoulder, and I grumbled a sleepy, "Stop it," to my wife. "It's me, Uncle Tom." My nephew's voice responded quietly. For a moment, I almost wanted to ignore him, but the stressed tone in his voice was too urgent. "What's up, buddy?" I asked, groggily, sitting up to push the sleep out of my eyes. "There's someone outside my window," he whispered. This woke me right up. Within moments, I was quietly tiptoeing down the hall, following Jacob's lead to peer out his window. Now the moon was near full, and the white snow on the ground gladly reflected back its light to make it quite bright outside, despite it being so early. "Over there, by that tree," Jacob said, pointing out into the yard, by the edge of the forest. Squinting, I tried to see what he was seeing. "I don't see anything, mate," I told him gently, so as not to dissuade him, but he insisted. "No, it's right there," he insisted urgently. I of course looked again. For a long moment, I searched and found nothing. I was just about to turn back to him, to reassure him that there was nothing there, when suddenly, an unnatural shape caught my eye. Further into the woods than I had been expecting, stood the silhouette of a large, tall man wearing a big red coat. Relief washed over me. I knew what this was. That was the life-sized blow-up Santa my father-in-law usually put on the roof. Why it was on the ground I didn't know, Perhaps it blew down. Naturally, I reassured Jacob that it was just the Santa decoration from the roof, and I put him back to bed, closing the curtains so that he couldn't see it floating there menacingly. Then, I pulled on a jacket and slippers to march outside. It was my intention to retrieve the damn thing so that it wouldn't blow away any further or scare the crap out of any more of my nieces or nephews. But when I got out there, I couldn't find it. Apparently the view from the window was different or something, because I spent a good 10 minutes marching around out there, unable to find it. When I got to the spot that I thought I'd seen it, I found the snow there to be slightly disturbed. In the moonlight, I could see little sparkles of something on the snow. Red glitter? That's weird, I thought. Then I noticed there was a present box sitting half nestled behind the nearest tree. Confused, I picked it up. The label on it was addressed to Jacob in letters big enough for me to make out in the dim light, so I decided to take it back inside with me. I was maybe halfway back to the house when I realised something that sent a chill down my spine. Up on the roof of the house was Santa in all his plastic glory, with a jolly smile and friendly wave, lit up from within by a cheerful light. I felt my head spin as I pieced the thoughts together. If blow-up Santa was up there, still plugged in, then what the heck had I seen in the woods? Was whatever I saw still out there with me? I legged it back inside, still clutching the Christmas present I'd found. Immediately upon returning to safety, I woke up my wife quietly, and she in turn woke up her father and sister. In almost no time, we were a quiet assembly of people gathered around the table, staring at this box. "Should we open it?" my wife asked, nervously. "Ew, no. What if there's something dead in it, or poisoned?" my sister-in-law asked. "I'll do it," my father-in-law huffed gruffly, moving in to grab it. But I spoke up quickly. "I think I should do it. I've already touched it. If there's something bad or poisonous, better that only one of us be exposed to it." Heavy silence followed before my father-in-law nodded in agreement. Gingerly, I looked over the box. It was light, and nothing rattled, so I began unwrapping it delicately. Inside was a set of kids' pajamas, red and green, striped, with an elf hat to complete the look. Tucked under the clothes, however, was a card. I already didn't like where this was going, but took up the note anyway, to read aloud for everyone. "Dear Jacob, I could use another little helper this year. Won't you come be my best elf? Love, Santa." All I'm saying is a warning, fella. Sometimes fellas like you go in them swamps without a blessing. Sometimes them fellas don't ever come back. The pointed words of the Gunawingu elder echoed in my ears as we followed the winding tributary deep into a dark, heavy mass of tidal mangrove swamp. There had been no malice or threat in them, just an unnerving certainty that my boss seemed to miss as he snorted something about superstitious nonsense and thanked the man for nothing. I kind of wondered why he'd even bothered seeking the elder's blessing if he was just going to go ahead with the trip anyway. Image, I suppose. If there was one thing Dr. Irvin Wexley cared about more than anything, it was image. I apologised for his disrespect and asked the man if there was anything I could offer that would compensate for his wasted time. He gave me a kindly smile and shook his head. "So good, mate. Some fellas'll never learn. Nothing a man can do about that. You got enough respect to apologise, even though you done nothing wrong, and that's enough for an old fella like me. Ain't your fault the boss don't got any." I shook his hand, thanked him again, and turned to leave. But his hand tightened on mine, lingering for a moment. "You just be careful out there, mate. Them swamps been around a long time, before us folk even got here, and fellas like your old boss tend to attract trouble. Look, there are good people and there are not so good people, and that's true about anything human beings are involved in. Science is no different, and Wexley was definitely the latter. Arrogant, egotistical, and only worried about progress if it personally benefited him in some way. The man could not have been more pompous and self-serving if he'd tried. More than once he managed to beat accusations of stealing others' work and publishing it as his own. Wexley might have been a prehistoric dick, but he had a lot of influence. Working for him was like a golden ticket in many ways. Do a good job, and you'd be at the head of any list you wanted to be on. A year or two of misery opened so many doors that I couldn't pass up the offer, really. Maybe that makes me as bad as him on some level, but I comforted myself with the fact that I genuinely just wanted to be in a position to make a real difference, even if no one ever knew my name. We were sitting in one of 4 little aluminium dinghies, puttering slowly up a narrow tidal creek into one of the largest mangrove swamps in the region, and one that had never really been scientifically investigated. Wexley was heading up a wildlife survey, keen to attach his name to as many new species as he could. I gazed into the forbidding mangroves as we slid past. The elder's warning stuck in my head, and in that twisted maze of ancient mangroves, I definitely felt a chill. The place was creepy, no doubt. The swamp itself opened up before us not too far down the creek, the narrow channel spilling into a shallow depression spread over 25 square kilometres. Weaving erratically between the mangroves were deeper channels where the water drained with the tide, and dotted around the swamp were tiny splits of dry land that varied in size from a few metres to several hundred. The first thing I noticed, of course, were the crocodiles. They startled into the water as the boats approached, or popped their heads under the surface with a barely perceptible swirl. They were the biggest danger of doing any work in the NT. Capable of happily taking a human, and even a 5-metre croc can be completely invisible in 2 feet of water. Because of the crocs, we had to find a decent piece of land on which to make camp. Aerial shots showed that toward the middle of the swamp there existed a sizable island where we would be at least a few hundred metres from the water. So we slowly wound our way around the mangrove choke channels towards it. A few hundred metres obviously doesn't make you completely safe from the crocs, but it all helps, especially when one side of the island turns out to be a sheer 2-metre drop into the water. Crocodiles are very poor climbers. With camp set up near the steeper bank and a hot wire stretching low to the ground around the perimeter, to at least make any marauding reptiles think twice, we settled in for the first night. This was usually the one time on expedition I could guarantee the lecherous Wexley would leave me alone, given his steadfast refusal to mingle with us commoners in a social sense. We cooked on an open fire, told tall tales of ghost stories,
and just generally enjoyed being free of the man for a few hours. That night, in my tent, I had the strangest dream. As with most dreams, I only remembered snatches of it, but there was still enough to set an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach for the whole morning. In the dream, I was floating in black water, surrounded by dozens of crocodiles in a circle, lazily eyeing me off. I started to panic, treading water in faster and faster circles to try and keep an eye on them all at once. And then one of them broke ranks and started drifting towards me. I braced for an attack, but before it came, the crocodile morphed into an image of the elder from earlier on. His skin was unnaturally black. His beard and hair had turned shockingly white, and his eyes glowed with a purple fire. He stood on the surface of the water, with those purple eyes boring into me. Leaning down slightly, he whispered, "The Keeper awakens." Then he shot down in the water in a plume of spray, sending the crocodile scattering, and I woke up. The next day, I mercifully found myself free of Wexley again. He assigned me the task of overseeing the crocodile traps, because as part of the survey, we wanted to get an idea of the number and the size of the animals in the area, and start tracking some of them to see where they went at different times of the year and so forth. Typical Wexley, he genuinely saw more value in the opportunity to discover a new species of gnat he could name after himself, than in studying the largest predator in the ecosystem. Not that I was going to complain about being well away from him. We'd brought 4 traps with us, 10-metre long and reinforced steel cages that could either float on the surface of the water in a special rig or rest on the bottom in the shallows or on the bank. They were designed so that even truly huge 5 to 6 metre crocodiles could be safely contained, tagged and sampled before release. So they weighed quite a lot, and they were ungainly to transport. As a result, we had to set them up one at a time before heading back to base camp and picking up the next trap. It took pretty much all day. We baited them with feral pig carcasses and set them where we thought the big crocs would probably hang out. From then, it was really just a matter of waiting. Back at camp, Wexley had already returned and summoned me to his tent to marvel at some potential new species or other. A yellow eel. In fact, but despite his self-important boasting, I was pretty sure he'd just caught a rare colour morph of the common swamp eel. Still, I knew better than to correct him, and so I just agreed that it could be a promising find, and told him I smelled like boar innards and needed the shower. Camp showers are hardly luxurious, so after a quick soap job, I threw on a fresh set of clothes and retired to the main fire, happy to while away the night in the company of the other workers. Sleep was, as far as I could tell, dreamless that night, and I woke feeling re-energized. Hopefully, we'd have something in the traps, and the real science could begin while Wexley gallivanted uselessly about the other side of the swamp looking for the next unfortunate creature to bear his name. Unfortunately, the traps were empty. Not a huge setback by any means. Crocodiles are surprisingly wary of change in their environment, especially for such a powerful and aggressive predator. And it might take a couple of days before they approach closely enough to really get a bead on the bait. Once they did though, that wariness would disappear in an instant. I decided that, since we had no crocodiles to wrestle, we should start a bit of a catalogue on the animals we could see in the swamp. Because of the sparsity of dry land, there were very few large animals, but still, the mangroves were full of life. We photographed birds, lizards and crabs that scurried in between the breathing roots at low tide, and even a huge colony of flying foxes high up in some of the tall gums of the low edge of the swamp itself. Then, as we came around the back edge of the swamp, we entered a relatively wide lagoon that seemed strangely devoid of life. No birds moved through the leaves of the mangroves or stalked mudskippers on the margins. Nothing stirred. The water beneath us, previously never more than about 6 or 7 feet deep, plummeted to over 30 feet. I heard a splash off to the right just as we rounded the corner into the bay, turning just in time to see a huge swirl on the surface of the water as something very large submerged. Crocodiles basically exist in a sort of loose territorial hierarchy, with the bigger and older males ruling over the territory, while the smaller males jostle for position beneath them. Eventually, the smaller males grow larger and are forced to either challenge the dominant male or leave the river and move to a new territory. We'd just found the perfect territory for a dominant super croc, and that splash told me he wasn't too far away. I decided to move one of the nearby traps into the little creek that led us into the wider expanse of open water, reasoning that at some stage our super croc would have to pass it on his way in or out. If we could get data on that dominant croc in a reasonably untouched area, it could do a lot more for our knowledge of the species. We set the trap, added a bit more bait to make it even more enticing, and then headed back to home to rest for the night. That night I dreamed again, but these were more like genuine nightmares. Disjointed images and emotions, flashes of mangrove swamp and black water tainted with rage and hate. I woke in a puddle of sweat just before dawn, real adrenaline flowing through my veins. We checked the nearest traps to camp, and sure enough, this time we'd caught a couple of middling males. Both around the 4-metre mark. They were perfect candidates for the long-term tags because they were approaching the size where crocodiles start to look for their own territory. A swamp like this one acted as a fantastic nursery, and it would be of great interest to us where the animals that eventually moved on from here ended up. Both were released missing only a few vials of blood and a single scale from their tails, which would be used for DNA analysis. The third trap still sat empty, and given we'd only just moved the fourth, I decided to let it soak for another day or so. The food in there was enough to keep a crocodile alive for a year or more, and the position of the trap meant there could be no danger of an animal overheating or drowning. It wouldn't hurt to leave it undisturbed for a while, especially because the bigger crocs are usually the wilier ones. 2 days later, we headed back towards the very back of the swamp, eager to see if we'd had any luck. We'd since caught another 2 crocodiles over 4 metres long, an indication that the dominant animal must be even larger. We were potentially in record territory given the undisturbed nature of the place, but we weren't at all prepared for what we found as we came around the bend in the small stream. The trap was gone. For a moment, I felt panic at the fate of the crocodile that must have entered it, thinking that maybe it somehow managed to shift the trap into deeper water, sink, and drown. These things were designed to hold a 1-ton slab of thrashing muscle firm, but I couldn't see any other reason it would be missing completely. I would have been shattered if we'd caught the big boy only to have him die in our trap, and I cursed myself for not checking it earlier. Not far into the bay though, I saw something much worse. The trap was sitting on the shoreline, empty, and torn open like a flimsy birdcage. There were a chorus of gasps that echoed my own horrified conclusion. How the hell could something like that happen? I noticed a severed tail tangled in the wrecked steel, and my hand flew to my mouth. Was that the remains of the dominant croc we'd been after? And what the hell had happened here? Without a lot of choice, we motored over and surveyed the carnage. The first thing I noticed was that the tail was only relatively small, probably from an animal no larger than 3.5 metres, and certainly not from a true giant. That only brought up more questions. What had happened to the trap? Someone suggested poachers, trying to blow it open and getting the charge totally wrong. Someone else agreed, but I just couldn't. Surely we'd have heard explosions. I started to look fearfully at the deep, dark water of the lagoon. Could there possibly be a crocodile lurking in there, big enough to do that to a reinforced steel trap? Of course, Wexley blamed me for whatever happened out there in that lagoon, and I had to spend a good hour trapped in his tent while he raged and screamed. Over the course of his ranting, I apparently used a flimsy trap, sabotaged the trap to ruin his good name somehow, advertised our presence to poachers, had been working with poachers, and eventually became the poacher myself. I'm sure there were more, but I just tuned it out and assured him that I'd get to the bottom of it. I really had no idea how I'd get to the bottom of it, but I would have to, because if I didn't, Wexley was liable to block me from working anywhere decent ever again out of sheer spite. Part of my solution lay in setting up camera traps on the three-ways in and out of the deeper lagoon where the trap had been destroyed. At least that way, I thought, I might get an image of potential poachers creeping around. Give Wexley someone else to rage at. I still didn't believe the poacher explosion theory, but what else could it be? Nothing else unusual happened for a few days, and the cameras picked up nothing out of the ordinary. We just went about our work, although my dreams continued to be dark and strange, and I didn't sleep that well. Then, a few days after the incident with the trap, one of the boats failed to return. We were late ourselves, having caught a couple of small crocodiles, and when we arrived back at the camp, it was buzzing with activity. Apparently the missing dinghy had managed to radio just one word, help, before all communication was lost. I immediately feared the worst, not even thinking about the trap incident, and figured they must have been overturned by a big crocodile. There have been plenty of cases where large animals have stalked and ambushed small boats, sometimes throwing the occupants into the water. I became even more concerned when I learned they had been operating down one of the channels that led out to the lagoon, down the far end of the swamp where even I had yet to venture. Wexley posed a problem though. He flat out forbade any attempt to go and find the researchers. He said they were probably just lost and refused to entertain the idea that anything might have happened to them. Nonsense, you idiot. These same slackers have been behind on their work for days. No doubt they're just catching up, or their incompetence has them lost. They'll learn a valuable lesson spending a night out in the swamp. As though he hadn't spent the whole week and a bit looking for living vanity plates. I stopped short of saying that to his face, of course, but I did tell him in no uncertain terms that I was going to find the missing researchers. He went so red I thought his eyes might start bleeding, and told me if I defied him, I could expect to never work in the field again. But recommendations be damned. I couldn't live with myself if one or more of those researchers were in trouble and I did nothing about it. Thankfully, the rest of the crew agreed, and Wexley was powerless against the numbers and unwilling to dent his image by making a scene. Myself and 5 others piled into 2 separate boats and headed off as quickly as we dared through the dark, narrow channels. A northern Australian mangrove swamp is no place for humans to be poking around at night. Out there, the darkness belongs to the crocodiles. Even with the rifles we carried for the worst case scenario, it's no good shooting at something you can't see. We had to take our time, making sure we didn't run into a submerged log or any other obstacle that might put us in the middle of the food chain. Back near the lagoon, we were once again greeted by oppressive silence, as though the whole swamp was holding its breath. The very far end of the lagoon looked utterly foreboding. The mangroves almost forming a tunnel over the small channel the missing group had been working in, shrouding it from any natural light. The limbs of the trees caught the spotlights, giving them a beckoning, skeletal appearance that only made the inky pool of darkness further down the stream even less inviting. I scanned the lagoon, the idea of a monster croc re-emerging at the back of my mind. But it was as still as glass, apart from our own wake, and shortly we were enveloped by that darkness as we entered the small creek. It didn't take long to find the boat, although it wasn't in the creek. Somehow it had been wedged in a thicket of mangroves, maybe 3 meters off the ground. Had it come in too fast and clipped the bank? We pulled cautiously into the mud and, against my better judgment, I got out of the boat. The mud gripped my ankles like grasping hands, and getting over to the strangely suspended dinghy was a real slog. Shining a torch on the hull, I felt my jaw drop at the extent of the damage. The thick aluminium jagged and torn all down the right-hand side of the boat. That couldn't have been caused by the soft bank. Caught up in marvelling at the state of the boat, I almost missed the movement to my right, deeper in the thick mangroves and away from the water. A figure rose from the mud and I flinched, almost dropping the torch as it began charging towards me as fast as the mud would allow. I calmed slightly when I recognised it as one of the missing members, although his maddened eyes kept me well on edge as he approached. I braced myself in the case of collision, but he sloshed right past me, uttering a single word: "Run!" Despite the man's panic and his insistence that they were dead, we made a point of searching for the others he had been dealing with. The thick mud and heavy darkness made it hard, and we couldn't do too much on foot anyway, so we had to throw in the towel after about an hour. Wexley, the man who had raged against anyone even going searching, now raged that we hadn't found the other two at any cost. One of the workers threatened to throw him in the swamp, and he stormed off to his tent in a temper. The scientist we rescued could shed almost no light on the situation. Whatever had happened seemed to have sent him into shock, and since picking him up he had said next to nothing and not responded to any questions. All he did was mutter to himself, repeating the same sentence: "It was so big. It was so big." I was forced, reluctantly, to accept that my initial theory had been correct. They must have run afoul of a big croc, although I had no explanation for how the boat wound up so heavily damaged and up in the trees. Maybe the two unfortunate others had fallen in when the croc hit the boat, and the survivor had gunned the engine and hit the submerged rock or something near the bank. In my haste to find a logical explanation, I simply glossed over how far up the creek that boat had been. A huge mistake in hindsight, because the creek didn't offer any opportunity for the chain of events I'd imagined. At the time though, I just accepted that I must be at least on the right track, made sure the injured survivor was comfortable and monitored, and then went to bed. After all, I figured we were going to have a body recovery mission in the morning. That night, I dreamed again. The same out-of-focus snatches of erratic imagery backed with bubbling rage. I felt like I was racing through the swamp at great speeds, the land itself giving way to my presence. The rage gave way to a thrill like I'd never felt before. The thrill of a hunter locked onto its prey. I charged through a deep channel, as though it was just a trickle, ramming into something with enough force that it exploded, waking me up. Except the explosion wasn't only in my dream. My eyes snapped open in time to see the orange light of a boiling fireball wash over the tent, the heat and the shockwave blowing through like a gust of wind. Something bellowed, and groggy shouts turned to screams in terror outside. The ground, dry underneath the camp, trembled both with the aftershocks of the explosion and the movement of something big. I raced out of my tent, eager to escape the flimsy plastic shelter, but before I took more than a few steps, I was stopped dead in my tracks by the scene unfolding in front of me. Whatever had exploded, probably one or more of the drums of fuel near the generators, had already splashed hot flame around the campsite and bathed everything in a nightmarish orange glow. At the centre of the flame stood a creature like nothing I'd ever seen before, tall, bipedal and reptilian. It surveyed the camp around it with black eyes before letting out a bellow that showed off glistening, crocodilian teeth and a blunt snout. The skull was ringed with short, gnarled horns, and it moved slightly on long, muscular limbs, using its arms to help it out across the ground like an ape. Dinosaurian claws and feet completed the image of sheer terror, and I gasped as it grabbed a man straight out of his tent, swung him up high and effortlessly tore him in half. I suppose I screamed. I didn't hear myself. In fact, the world had somehow gone almost silent, as though I was listening to everything through earplugs. I watched the blood, so much blood, shower around the creature in an arc as it tossed the twitching remnants of its victim to the ground, transfixed by the splatter as it hit the earth. It bellowed triumphantly and fixed its eyes on another victim, scooping her up effortlessly and decapitating her with its blunt jaws. I ran. Whatever sense of shock had held me in place snapped and I ran, the bellow of the beast echoing through the mangrove swamp behind me. My hearing returned to normal and I could hear the terrified cries of my colleagues, but I knew I could do absolutely nothing to help them. That thing would deal with me just as easily, I reasoned, and so I saved myself, dashing headlong through the trees in a frenzied effort to escape. Behind me I felt the creature roar again, and a quick glance showed me that it had started heading in the same direction as me, tearing through the rest of the site. As I focused in front of me again, a figure leapt out of the shadows, tackling me to the ground. Wexley, that snivelling, slimy prick. For a split second I wondered if he'd decided to use the confusion to do something about all the leering looks. But as he clamped his hand over my mouth and manically rasped out his intentions, I realised he was a much worse human than I'd ever given him credit for. "You little shit! I told you not to look for those idiots. Now you've brought back some fucking monster. This'll fucking ruin me, unless... Yes, the only survivor of a tragic incident, Dr. Irvin Wexley. Serves you right too, you little shit. You so nearly made it, but sadly for your family, you broke your ankle at the final hurdle." Agony flared in my leg as he drove his boot into my ankle with surprising power, snapping bones and effectively sentencing me to death. I thrashed and kicked, thinking I might be able to at least scuffle with him long enough to take him with me when the monster arrived. But the pain in my leg was still too raw. Realisation washed over me as he found his feet again and stood, laughing over the top of me. I was going to die. Then, behind Wexley, I noticed a shifting in the shadows. Somehow the creature had crept closer and now stood in the darkness, looming over the evil bastard who just ensured my death. In a weird way, I did feel a sense of satisfaction that he wouldn't be making it out either. I must have smiled at the idea, because Wexley frowned and followed my eyes. Then he started screaming like a frightened schoolgirl. The creature picked him up in a clawed hand, his screams continuing as it examined him closely. I think I heard him beg amongst all the blubbering, and I couldn't help but chuckle at that. I felt totally at peace somehow, resigned to my fate and detached from reality. Realistically, I guess I was in shock from my injury and the way that my life so suddenly gone to hell. I watched with a twisted kind of fascination as the creature repeatedly slammed Wexley into the ground with the force of a pile driver, reducing him to a floppy mass of flesh before tossing him distastefully into the night. Then it turned its gaze on me. I held my breath as it moved to stand directly over me, wondering how it might choose to dispose of me, how it would feel, and what I would experience after it did. It leaned down and I braced myself for the crushing bite, but it never came. Instead, the thing looked at me, black eyes almost soulful. We shared a stare for what felt like several minutes, before it growled and took off into the night, leaving me to lie there and wonder when the crocs would find me. I'm not sure how long I spent out there. I tried to drag myself back towards the camp, but I couldn't. My ankle had been left at an awful angle, and there was no way I could drag myself more than a few feet. I'd been spared just to wind up an easy meal for a crocodile, and maybe die of shock or thirst. This time, I really did feel the despair. As the sun rose, though, I heard motion in the camp. Hushed, shell-shocked voices told me the others must have survived as well. But it did me no good, because they never came anywhere close to where I lay, and I didn't have the strength to call out. It wasn't long before I heard the sound of a boat motor, and I realised that they must have been leaving. I definitely blacked out more than once, chopping the baking hot day into sections as I got weaker and weaker. Then, after who knows how long, I woke to find a figure standing over me. Through flashes, I realised I was being moved, although by whom or to where I had no idea. When I did fully come around, darkness had fallen, and I'd been placed by a fire while someone coaxed me to drink. As my senses returned to at least basic functionality, I found myself staring into the concerned face of the Gunawingu elder. I tried to sit up, and he gently dissuaded me. "Easy, mate. Take it easy. Been a rough day. Do you just relax? Be sending the chopper out for you in the morning. Here, drink a bit of this." He helped me to sip from the cup, liquid that tasted like a very bitter herbal tea. I felt my face scrunch up and he laughed. "Yeah, she tastes pretty ordinary, all right, but it'll do you good. Kill the pain for starters." Sure enough, within half an hour the pain in my leg had dulled to a throb, and I was able to sit up and talk with the man. I felt like he must have a good idea of what happened, and so I told him everything, pouring out the emotion of the last week or so while he sat and listened, his expression kind and wise. When I finished, he sighed and sat quietly for a moment. "It ain't a monster, mate. We call it the Keeper of the Lagoon. At least that's the best translation for it in English. Legend goes it was once a warrior of our tribe, till he messed with an evil spirit that lived in the lagoon. Legend goes the spirit was snatching young'uns up, and this warrior fella decided to do away with it. He managed to defeat the spirit, but it left behind darkness, ready to turn some other poor fella into something evil and continue the cycle. So this warrior, he called on the ancestors and turned himself into a crocodile so he could guard the swamp and keep the world out of the swamp and the darkness out of the world. Nowadays, most white fellas don't put much stock in our legends. Whatever came first, the legend or the beast, I had no doubt that I'd be putting a lot more stock in the local indigenous stories. I asked him why it didn't kill me or the other survivors, and he flashed a knowing smile. I said I wasn't going to give your boss the blessing, never said nothing about letting the rest of you go in there without it. His smile faded, leaving behind a sadness. Shame it didn't save yous all. Sorry about that, really. Can't say why it did what it did to the others. I suppose I ain't ever had to protect so many folks, and I ain't had to do it from a distance. Maybe it wasn't as strong. Maybe they found it, had some of the darkness in them already. He wouldn't let them leave then. I did my best to assure him that we'd all be dead without his blessing, but he seemed forlorn. Eventually, I fell asleep and woke the next morning to the thumping of rotors. The elder made sure I got on board safely and waved me off, his face once again covered with a kindly smile. We climbed higher, banking over the swamp. Even just looking at the place from the air sent my heart rate skyrocketing, especially when the lagoon came into view. From the air, the water looked even darker, and as I peered down, I could have sworn I saw the wake of something huge, moving just below the surface.
I love visiting my grandma. She always makes the food that I like, and in large quantities, and spoils me. With the hustle and bustle of college life, it's nice to go back to my childhood and allow myself to be spoiled for a few hours every few weeks. Even though she has 6 grandchildren, she made it clear that I'm her absolute favourite. She'd often have the whole family around for dinner, and after they left, she'd bring out the good stuff she made just for me. We usually have a big Christmas dinner together with the whole family. However, as the years go by and the younger ones start growing up, fewer and fewer people show up. Last year, everyone already made plans, forgetting about poor Grandma. I don't blame them, but they often forget how these visits mean a lot to her, especially since Grandpa died. That's why when I talked on the phone with her and she asked me if I had any plans, I lied to her and told her I didn't. She immediately jumped at the opportunity to politely invite me, going so far as to offer for me to sleep over at her place. She said there's one room which hasn't been used in years, and I could stay in there. I immediately said yes and agreed to stay over, realising how happy that would make her. I cancelled the plans I made with my friends, telling them something else came up. Although they were bummed about it a bit, their drinking party wouldn't stop because of me. That was the last Christmas that I would ever spend with my grandma. On Christmas Eve, I arrived to my grandma's place, and she greeted me like she always does, with a tight hug and lots of kisses. I barely even stepped inside when she started offering me food. She'd already made what could only be described as an all-you-can-eat buffet. We dug in, and once we were done, she showed me where I could sleep for the night. It was a cosy little bedroom, which apparently used to be my mum's room when she was little. Grandma told me not to leave my room during Christmas night in order to avoid disrupting Santa in his work. She said that if I really needed to use the bathroom, I could, but to be extremely quiet and not to go downstairs. On the nightstand, she left me a list of things I should do before I go to bed to ensure that I get a good present. I decided to play along and abide by the rules. I told her I'd read it before bed and do everything necessary, and she seemed content with that. She wished me good night and left the room. I was pretty tired from the trip there and the enormous dinner I've eaten, so I lay down on the bed and involuntarily fall asleep within minutes. I awoke a few hours later. I glanced at my watch and realised it was 3:01 a.m. I got up to grab a glass of water downstairs from the kitchen and groggily walked through the dark, trying to avoid any loud noises or turning on any lights, not to wake Grandma. I went downstairs and turned on the kitchen light, gulping down a glass of water. I glanced towards the living room, at the Christmas tree, and something caught my attention under the glow of the decorative lights. There was a small plate with a tiny paper that said, "For Santa." I reckoned it was for cookies and milk. But when I got closer, I realised that the plate was empty. Red liquid was in it, and right next to the plate was a small bucket. Obviously, I found this weird, but I figured that Grandma may have just forgotten to put it away or something. I turned off the kitchen lights and returned to my room. Just then, remembering the list my grandma gave me, I grabbed it off my nightstand and started reading. "Dear James, thank you for visiting me for Christmas. You made your grandma really happy. Now, Christmas is a little different in this house than what you're probably used to, so it's very important that you follow these rules on the list. 1. Make sure to close your windows and ensure they're closed properly. These old windows don't work properly sometimes, so if you feel like cold air is coming in, let me know. Number 2. Don't put any wood in the fireplace after 9 p.m. Santa will be really angry if it's scalding in the chimney or if there's still smoke. Number 3. You didn't forget about milk and cookies, did you? I stopped reading and chuckled at the list. Grandma clearly wanted me to follow the basic rules for Santa like when I was a kid. But again, I decided to oblige. I continued reading the list. In this household, we don't use milk and cookies. We use raw meat and blood. I already left a bucket by the Christmas tree, and there's a raw piece of chicken I put on the plate. Santa sure loves his diet. Number 4. If you're woken up by the sound of scratching or knocking on your window, ignore it. Your room is on the 2nd floor. There is no way to reach up to it. In fact, it's best not to look there. But if you see someone beckoning you, pretend they're not there. They may try to open the window from the outside. This is why it's so important to keep the windows closed. Number 5. You may hear growling coming from the kitchen. It's okay, because Santa never comes upstairs, and since I already left the chicken for him, that should satisfy him. By this point, I was sure Grandma was just messing with me. That was until I heard the sound of 3 gentle knocks on the window behind me. I froze in place, staring at the list, but practically staring through it. 3 more gentle knocks ensued, but I did my best not to give away the fact that I heard them. Once again, there were 3 more knocks, and the sound of scratching started. First gently, and then louder, as if a rat was trying to bite through the wall. It lasted around a minute, until it completely stopped. Only when it did I gather enough courage to slightly shift my position. That was a mistake though, because when I looked down on the floor, at the light which was cast in front of the window, I saw the unmistakable shadow in the form of a humanoid silhouette stretched across the floor. I couldn't tell for sure, but it looked like whoever was there held both his hands on the window and stared directly towards me. I decided that the best thing to do is continue reading the list and try to distract myself. Number 6. If someone walks into your room while you're sleeping and you happen to wake up, pretend that you're still asleep. In the worst case scenario, the person will sit on the edge of your bed and observe you. So do your best not to let them know you're awake. If you feel their breath on your neck and it gets progressively closer, it means they've realized you're awake. Number 7. You may hear me calling you from downstairs. Don't listen to it. I will under no circumstances go downstairs during the night. Number 8. Last and most important rule. If you get up to go to the bathroom, never, ever, ever turn on any lights in the house. He has trouble noticing you in the dark, but if you turn on the lights, he will be able to follow you wherever you go, and then not even locking your door will help. Number 9. Follow these simple rules, and in the morning, we can open your Christmas presents. Love, Grandma. The scratching and knocking had already stopped by the time I was done reading, and the shadow from the window was gone. I got into bed and covered myself over my head, shivering, and not from the cold. Sometime during the night, I heard my door open, and I did my best to ignore the footsteps and the low growling noise. I either passed out or fell asleep sometime later, but all I know is I woke up to the sound coming downstairs from the kitchen. I shot up, looking around the room and at the window, rubbing my temples and thinking about the nightmare I had. I left my room and immediately heard my grandma's voice calling me from downstairs to come open the presents. I told her I'm coming, when suddenly I felt a grip on my wrist. I turned around and saw Grandma there, staring at me, wide-eyed. She leaned in and whispered in my ear with a trembling voice, "You turned on the lights, didn't you?" That was unfortunately just the start of our ordeal. Initially, our theories on who had left it ranged from some deranged person who had somehow made their way all the way out to the ranch, to Jacob's father, who didn't know where the ranch was. Of course, none of these scenarios were very likely, and only fractionally plausible. We of course didn't tell Jacob that there was actually someone outside his window. Didn't want to freak the poor kid out. But we did make sure to keep a closer eye on all the kids. In the following days leading up to Christmas, we kept vigil, and minor incidents began to occur. In the mornings, we'd find footprints in the snow, covered in red glitter, that seemed to steadily be getting closer to the house. And even during the day, the household felt watched. When having our family game day, we would find tokens for an extra player when there wasn't one. And whilst outside building snowmen, we found pieces of torn Santa clothing that did not belong to our household. My father-in-law, not too subtly, kept his hunting guns closer at hand after that. The worst things happened during the nights, of course. Jacob would wake screaming that someone was coming to take him, or that something was outside his window, or tapping on it. But whenever we would get there to check, there was no one there. Only a light sprinkling of glitter. Come the morning of Christmas Eve, my brother-in-law stepped out the back for a cigarette and found a second gift box. Inside that one was what we guessed to be a squirrel, though it was too mangled and frozen to really say with any certainty. The evening settled in that night with a heaviness in the air. We could all feel it. The joy of Christmas was being leached from the air by more than my in-laws. When I went in to say goodnight to Jacob, I found him crying in his bed. When I asked him what was wrong, he insisted that Santa was going to turn him into an elf, and that he'd never see any of us again. Now, we of course never showed him that note, and when I asked him why he thought that, his answer was vague. I decided then and there that we'd keep watch over him for the night. That seemed to calm him somewhat, and he agreed to at least try to sleep. We worked it out amongst ourselves that I would take the first watch, followed by my brother-in-law, and then my father-in-law would take the final shift. I settled in for my watch with a book and a reading light at around 10 p.m. Christmas Eve. Things were pretty uneventful until just after midnight. And then I heard it. Disturbing me from my reading was the faintest sound coming from the window. Someone, I realised, was scratching something sharp against the glass to create a high-pitched scrape that seemed to reverberate down my spine. I stood slowly and took hold of the rifle that had been standing up beside me. I'm really still not that great with firearms. I approached the window. Using the barrel of the gun, I pushed back the curtains. What I saw next still has me shaken. Standing right there, with his face near pressed up against the window, was the most deranged individual I have ever seen. He was pressing the tip of a knife to the window, wearing a grungy Santa costume, and had long, scraggly grey hair hanging in greasy wads from under the Santa hat that in no way hid his male pattern baldness. The part that was the most disturbing and screamed lunatic the most, however, was his lips. They were bleeding and damaged. It was painfully clear that he'd been chewing off his own lips, leaving his toothless gums exposed in some places. What little remained of the lips was cracked, dry flesh, stretched into a horrendous smile. Standing in utter shock, I watched as he whispered out the words, "Santa's here to collect his little elf." That was enough to spur me into action. I closed the window and woke Jacob, ripping him out of his bed to carry him with me as I proceeded to scream bloody murder for the rest of the household to wake. By the time everyone was awake enough to process what I was telling them, the man was gone. My father and brother-in-law searched into the woods, while I stayed back home to guard the family. When they returned, they told me they'd lost the trail in the woods, but came across what they thought was where the man had been staying. At the far end of my father-in-law's property was a low cave. They had always assumed a bear lived in there. However, when the trail led them to it on this day, they found a ragged-looking elf costume with the name Jacob crudely sewn into it, and several half-chewed dead squirrels. They decided to turn back after that and called the police. So far, they've not found the guy, but they're still out there now searching with a tracker dog. Apparently, something similar happened to another family in the area last year. Only they hadn't been so lucky, and their son had been taken. Right now, everyone's still pretty shaken up, and Great Aunt Barbara is eating her weight in pudding, which is only making the experience more terrifying. We have, of course, offered the officers hot chocolate and Christmas lunch, though even now I still feel like we're being watched. So, yeah, that's how well my Christmas has gone. Yours? I have a specific memory from when I was 6 or 7. It's actually my earliest memory. But to this day, I can't tell if it was a dream or not. I was never much of an outdoors kid. I loved to watch from the window and look at all of the wilderness behind our house. But this one time, I looked out and I saw a figure just standing there. I still to this day can't recall any features that stood out. Just that something was standing, like a shadow. I wasn't scared or alarmed, and I just continued on like nothing was wrong. I told my parents that night over dinner about it, but they just shrugged it off, called it an overactive imagination. But all day, every day, for at least a week, I saw it. It never moved, not once. But then, one day, when I went to the window, it was no longer there in the shade of the trees. I continued on and played with my toys. About a week of nothing being there. I saw it one night. All of a sudden, I woke up from sleeping. It was hot. At least 90 degrees. I could feel beads of sweat dripping down my forehead. Yet I couldn't move anything but my eyes. I looked around my room, but in my corner, I saw it. It was just standing. Except it wasn't actually standing completely still. It was almost like it was glitching around my room. Slowly, it moved toward me. Not once did it take a step or make a natural human movement. Every few seconds, it would contort and make an unnatural and unexplainable shape. It was still nothing but a shadow. No identifiable human features were visible. Every time it got closer, I would feel hotter. My mouth was dry, my tongue like a barren desert. My eyes even began to get irritated because I was too scared to blink. Every time I would blink, it would get closer and closer. After what seemed like an infinite struggle to do anything, it was right beside me, standing over me. It was hotter than ever now. My skin burning hot, like an oven. It reached out. Its massive shadowy arm glitched around, contorting and making odd shapes. Almost as if it struggled to even exist. And then, its finger made contact with my skin, the flesh searing. I instantly screamed, loud, my body jumping up. My parents rushed into the room, worried I was hurt. My arm, which the creature had touched, was burning, the skin charring and bleeding. I still have a scar on my arm, and I never sleep without a nightlight. My hands are trembling as I write this. I'm hiding in my towel closet. I called the cops, but I don't think they're going to be here in time. I mean, who takes calls on Christmas Eve seriously? They probably think I'm some teenager, prank calling them since I got nothing better to do than take away time from someone's Christmas. Who in their right mind would believe what I'm about to say anyway? Let me back things up and set the scene for you. I live alone, 2 states away from family. I feel terrible for not being able to visit them this year. I've been having financial struggles as of recent. Paying off student loans is no joke. This is the first time I've been able to live on my own. I'm renting a cabin in the middle of butt-fuck nowhere, Wisconsin. All that's around is a convenience store and a bar. And the place is nice and the rent is cheap, so who am I to complain? 1 bed, 1 bath, and a cramped kitchen that's right behind the living room. The living room's got a nice fireplace too. Keeps the house warm through the night. So, now that you've got the picture, I need to share my experience, no matter how few people see it. I didn't have big plans for the holidays. Stay at home, watch some TV, eat a frozen pizza if I was lucky. No big fancy dinner, no visitors, just an average night. That's just what happened. I kicked back on the couch with a pizza in hand and watched Christmas movies until my eyes grew heavy. I was awakened by a knock at my door at around 11:45. It's dark and snowy outside, per usual this time of year. I don't get visitors, nor could I see who it was, so I looked out the small window in the living room. Frost cloaked the glass, making it a challenge to see who was waiting for my answer. I could make out a human-like figure. My gut was telling me to stay the hell away from what was at my door before I even got a chance to move. The snow was falling so heavily, it was hard to see anything beyond 6 feet of my house. I trusted my gut though, and moved to my room. I began to think I was a bad person for leaving whoever was out there in that icy mess. Just as the thought entered my mind, the knocking grew louder. I covered my ears in response to the noise beyond my door. I faced away, and it only got worse. I was right to trust my gut. I shouldn't open the door. I can't let this go on. I exhaled deeply and threw my legs over the bed as I reluctantly shuffled over to my door. I twisted the knob and peeked outside. The cold weather nipped at my face as a reply. "Hello?" I peered through the crack. "Hi," the person started. I began to make out facial characteristics and realised it was a young woman. "My car broke down, and this seemed like a good place to seek shelter." This was a red flag to me. There's a convenience store and a bar within a mile of each other. Why show up at a random house for help? Now, I consider myself a nice guy, but the holidays don't make me a giving person. I don't like my sleep being interrupted either. I started. I wasn't sure how to respond. Her behaviour was off, to say the least. She was glancing over her shoulder, as if she could see anything through the darkness and snow. "I can give you a number for a towing company. There should be an inn at least a few miles from here. The towing company can take you." She didn't seem satisfied. "Are you sure?" she inquired. "It's awfully cold out here, and I don't know how long it'll take them to get here." She began to look more paranoid, her eyes darting from side to side, up and down. It was really freaking me out. "Listen, hon, my house is a wreck, and it's the middle of the night. I'm sorry, I know it's the holidays, but I have a thing about letting strangers into my house." I immediately regretted saying those words, as her fear turned to anger. At this point, she became hysterical. She kicked, punched, and beat my door, trying to force herself in. Her polite words were now screams.
"Let me in! Let me in! Let me in! Let me in! Let me in!"
The Jane Doe at my door pounded harder and harder. It seemed like my door was about to break. What the hell are you supposed to do in this situation? So, in the spur of the moment, I just locked the door. The knob rattled violently, then stopped abruptly. I picked up my phone and alerted the authorities that there was a manic woman outside my house. At this point, I figured she'd given up and left. I sat down in front of the TV and tried to enjoy the rest of the night. I pondered why she was so upset. No family? Trauma? None of my theories added up. Just as my thinking had concluded, and I began to relax, I heard a faint sound. A sound that was so quiet, but seemed so loud. It was the shuffling of snow right outside my window. I pulled my blinds back and peeked outside. The dim light from the street lamps shone onto my white lawn. The woman was making a circle in the snow. I squinted, trying not to reveal my presence. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness outside. It was now 1 a.m. There were symbols I couldn't recognize, and a large pentagram in the center. When she finished her artwork, she looked right at me. She was staring right into my soul. Her gaze sent chills down my spine. Her mouth opened at inhuman angles. And then, a scream was released. I fell back into the couch. What the fuck do I do? I called the cops for a second time. Writing this, I'll be censoring my address for my own security. Here's how that phone call went. I need police. Please come quick.
Sir, we already have the sheriff and backup on their way. They should be there within the hour. Lock your doors.
I heard a click on the other end. What am I supposed to do now? I'm alone in this house, which seems much more ominous than the night before. There's some psycho lady standing in my yard in the middle of the night. To top it off, the cops that should be arresting this woman are probably out for drinks. I let out an audible sigh and sat on the floor with my back to the couch. This was not what I thought of as an ideal Christmas. I figured I might as well freshen up and get ready for bed. Any sliver of hope left in me was gone. Picked myself up off the floor and made my way to the bathroom. I couldn't risk her seeing me, so I just used the dim flashlight on my phone. I brushed my teeth and rinsed my face. Thought that might make me feel better, more alert. I was wrong. Once I'd finished, I heard a knock at the door, followed by a scream. It was deep, unlike the shrieks previously heard from the girl. Something in me clicked. I mustered the strength to peek outside. There were blue and red lights flashing, signaling help had arrived. But something was wrong. The lights from the car further illuminated my lawn. There were two mangled bodies left inside of what I can only describe as the altar. Remnants of black uniforms informed me of who they were. Another guttural howl was heard. This time, only a few feet away from my window. I did the only thing I could think of, and that was to hide. This brings me to the now. I'm in my towel closet. There are 2 dead bodies in the snow, and something outside of my house. Something not human. I don't know when she, or it, whatever the fuck you want to call it, will get inside. But my gut is saying that she will. I couldn't have picked a worse spot to hide. I feel like the idiot friend in the horror movie that gets plucked off first. Please, if you're reading this, protect yourself this holiday season. Don't let it know you're there. Don't be like me. Please, save yourself and your family. I just heard something coming down the chimney. And it's not Santa. She's inside. Please, make sure you lock everybody in their rooms on the night before Christmas. It is very important for everybody's health. The name Santa Claus came from Saint Nicholas. In Dutch, that would be Sint Nicholas. And that's where Santa Claus got his name. I can personally attest to the fact that this is false. My father was paranoid. Very paranoid. He was also a little crazy. Maybe more than just a little. We lived in a neighbourhood surrounded by trees in the mountains. Growing up, our house had cameras facing every single angle of our property. Not just regular cameras either. Night vision, infrared. The night vision just made everything look grey, but the infrared was blue and any heat signatures gave off an orange glow. I know this because he'd given me access to the cameras, and I frequently viewed them from my computer. Over the years, I've seen some weird things on these cameras, but that's a story for another time. The weirdest thing growing up was Christmas. The holiday itself wasn't weird. We got a Christmas tree, had presents, all the normal things. The weird part was the night before. My dad loves his cameras. We had them on 24/7, 364 days per year. You must be confused. There's 365 days in a year. Yes, you're correct. Every year, on the night before Christmas, my dad would turn off every single camera. Weird thing is, this wasn't just my dad. The other houses in my neighbourhood didn't have cameras or anything fancy, but some of my friends told me that they weren't allowed to leave their room either on that night. Anyway, on the night before Christmas, after we laid out the cookies and the milk, my dad would make me go to bed early. There was a lock on the outside of my door. My dad was never abusive towards me, but on the night before Christmas, he would always lock me in my room. Despite being paranoid and crazy, my dad was the nicest man I've ever known. The only time he ever scared me was how serious he got on the night before Christmas.
Dallin, do not leave this fucking room. You understand me? I'll let you run around the neighbourhood with your little friends doing whatever the hell you damn well please every single day. I'll let you stay on that computer for hours searching up God knows what, probably choking your chicken the entire day. The one thing I ask of you is do not leave your room on this night. Capiche?
Yeah, Dad, I know. You tell me the same thing every year, I know. 14-year-old me replied with attitude.
All right then. I don't want you to be another statistic.
You mean statistic? I smirked.
Yes, boy. I don't want you to become another statistic. You saw all those missing person reports I showed you? All those people gone missing on December 26th, day after Christmas, every year. That ain't gonna be my boy.
And with that, he left my room. He was so paranoid. Did he think Santa was going to kidnap me? Santa's not even real. Pfft. After he walked out of my room, I heard a click as he set the lock outside my door. I heard his footsteps protrude away as I turned over to my computer that displayed our camera footage. I counted down. 3, 2, 1, 0.5, 0.4, 0.3, 0.2, 0.1, and boom. Just like that, the camera footage shut off and displayed no feed connected. I felt like a psychic for being able to accurately predict the exact time it had shut off.
Good night, boy.
My dad shouted across the hall from his room. Good night, I shouted back. I hated this tradition. I loved going downstairs to eat junk food in the middle of the night, and I loved checking the camera to get a glance at the weird things I saw in the woods from time to time. But on this night every year, I couldn't go downstairs to eat junk food, and I couldn't bring it upstairs either. No food was allowed in my room. And all that just because of my dad's paranoia. Every year until this day, I just listened to my dad. After he shut off the camera footage and locked me in my room, I'd usually just accept it and go to sleep. For some reason, I just couldn't sleep. So despite my dad's wishes, I stayed up playing computer games. Around 2 a.m, I heard something on our roof. There were a lot of animals and other things in those woods, so this was a pretty common occurrence. But the sound I heard this time just sounded different. It sounded like something landed. Uh-oh, Killer Santa must be here, I joked to myself as I continued playing my game. Shortly after the thud on the rooftop, I started hearing heavy footsteps, followed up by our floorboards creaking downstairs. Goosebumps formed on my body, and my breathing got a bit more frantic as I worked up a sweat. What the fuck is that? I thought to myself. Then, I got a thought. A thought that would prove to be the worst decision I've ever made in my life. I jumped onto the application that controls the cameras, looked over to the button that would reactivate them, and hovered my cursor over it. What if it's an intruder? I tried convincing myself. I took a deep breath, followed by a loud gulp. Then I clicked on Activate. The night vision cameras switched on. There were almost 50 boxes on my screen, each one blinking on separately. After a few seconds, they were all on. I had my eyes peeled, looking at each box, but seeing nothing out of the ordinary. That is, until I saw the living room camera. Standing in front of our dining room table, next to the Christmas tree, was a huge, overweight man in a Santa suit. He had a long beard and glasses. It was the textbook definition of what Santa looked like. My eyes were wide and filled with astonishment, as well as an equal mix of excitement and fear filling my brain. It was exciting, but weird. It's even more weird that I can't go downstairs. What would Santa do to me if I did? As I was staring at the screen, staring at Santa eating cookies, I noticed that his hand froze right in front of his mouth. I saw him slowly lower the cookie back onto the plate. He turned around, and he looked directly into the camera. He slowly brought his hand up in front of him and wagged his finger side to side. He knew I was watching him. When he did this, I slammed my hands onto the desk to boost myself up so I could dive under my bed and pretend to be asleep. I accidentally made contact with my keyboard, causing the camera to switch from night vision to infrared. What I saw on the camera was not Santa anymore. It was a big, fat creature with no clothes on. Its mouth was wide open, and it looked like it had a broken and detached jaw. It had large, oval eyes that had nothing in them. Rows of large, razor-sharp teeth filled its mouth. The creature was tall, and its arms were long and deformed. At the edge of its arms were hands with sharp claws that replaced its fingers. I screamed for my father. Instantly after, I heard footsteps shuffling to my room.
What did you do, boy? Why are you still awake?
He yelled as he unlocked the door and ran into my room. He looked at my computer and saw the camera footage on. I was on my bed crying. Suddenly, I could hear a heavy thud on our staircase.
Oh, you stupid son of a bitch. You stupid, stupid little boy. What have you done?
He said, as my crying became hysterical. He sat down next to me, hugged me so tightly, as if it was the last time he'd ever see me. And he whispered, "I love you, boy. Don't be scared. Ain't nothing gonna happen to you." We heard another thud coming from our staircase. The footsteps were so heavy, there was dust coming down from my ceiling.
I don't know if you're gonna see me again, boy, but I want you to always remember what I taught you.
Why wouldn't I see you again, Dad? What's gonna happen?
We can't both escape. It won't let us, boy.
Dad, I love you. I don't want you to leave. My dad got up and opened the window. We were on the second floor. He picked me up, kissed me on the cheek as a tear ran down his. He threw me out of the second-story window. I landed in some bushes below our house. I don't know if I was injured or not. I had too much adrenaline coursing through my veins.
Run, boy!
He screamed as the thuds got faster. I took off running through the woods when I heard the most disturbing, blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. I just kept running until I couldn't hear the screams anymore. And that was many, many years ago. I kept running until I tired myself out. I fell asleep under a tree. I returned to the house the following morning of the 26th. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing. My dad was just gone. I checked the cameras. The footage too was gone. Looking through the recordings, it was just blank for the entire night. I'm a father now myself, and I've kept my dad's tradition alive every night before Christmas. I don't know if that thing was isolated to my neighbourhood, or if that really is what Santa is for everyone. All I know is I'm not gonna risk finding out. So with all of that said, please, lock all of your doors on the night before Christmas. The next time you're awake during that night and you hear noises in your house, I suggest you stay in bed and keep your eyes closed. Don't get up. Don't investigate. Don't be a curious little fucker like I was. The last thing I'll leave you with is this. You better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. 'Cause Santa Claus is coming to town. He knows when you are sleeping, and he knows when you're awake. But he doesn't care if you've been bad or good. So don't go looking for him. For your own sake. I'm going to make this as short and as clear as possible. If you find any Christmas presents under your tree after Christmas Day that you didn't place there, call the police. Leave the house immediately. And whatever you do not open that gift. I lived with my wife Maria and my 2 young boys in Melbourne, Australia. That's where my wife is originally from, and most of her family lives less than an hour from us. On Christmas Day, we usually have a lot of presents under the tree. Gifts from me and my wife, gifts from grandparents, gifts from the boys, all are placed there. And that's why last Christmas we weren't worried when I found a present under the tree that neither me or my wife had put there. It could have been from one of our parents when they came to visit on Christmas Eve. It could have been from one of the boys. It could have been from many people. And we didn't give it a second thought. It had no gift tag on it. So we decided to leave it there and not open it until we found out who it was for and who sent it. So when I got up early on the 26th to make my coffee, that was the only present left under the tree. It was a small box, maybe 6 inches tall and 6 inches wide, wrapped in bright red wrapping paper. There was a little green bow on top, and it all looked expertly wrapped. But when I came out into the living room that morning, there was something off about that present that I couldn't place. It was not until later that I realised the wrapping paper had been completely green on Christmas Day. And it wasn't until later that I noticed that red had leaked onto the floor around the present as well. Throughout the day, our kids played with their new Christmas loot, as Maria and I called different relatives, asking if they had left a little red gift under our tree. As the day went by, and more family members told us that they hadn't sent a gift, we started to get confused. We were not worried, but we were definitely puzzled. There had been no signs of a break-in or forced entry, but the gift had to have come from somewhere. Mary and I spent the entire day trying to figure it out. And when night came around, we were mentally exhausted. We put the kids to bed and followed soon after. Now, I'm usually a pretty heavy sleeper, but something woke me up that night. I'm not sure if it was a noise I heard or if I just had too much coffee during the day. But I found myself wide awake at 2 a.m. and my throat was dry as hell. I finally slid out from under the covers and slipped into my slippers, careful not to wake Maria sleeping next to me. I walked out of our bedroom to the kitchen, almost slipping on some spilled water on the floor. Muttering a curse, I turned on the kitchen light and poured myself a glass of water from the fridge. I stood there in silence for a few minutes, drinking my water as I leaned against the kitchen counter. My mind was occupied with travel plans. We were going to Japan for New Year's. And when I finished the water, I put my glass in the sink and turned around to turn off the light. By chance, I happened to glance over to the hallway that connected to the living room. And that's when I froze. From where I stood, I could see right to our Christmas tree, and I saw that the mysterious present had been opened. And what I had almost slipped on, what I had first thought was spilled water, was revealed to be a trail of bright red blood, leading from the open present towards the bedrooms. My body was frozen in shock for a few minutes, but I quickly snapped out of it. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we had, and I crept over to the hallway, careful not to make a sound. My heart was racing as I followed the trail of crimson back towards the bedrooms, and my blood froze when I realised that it was leading me into the boys' room. I stood outside the bedroom doorway for a moment, trying to build up my courage for whatever waited for me in the darkness. Then I sprang into action, running into the room and switching on the lights in one quick movement. I had tried to prepare myself, but what I saw made the knife slip out of my hand and my jaw drop in horror. My boys had twin beds, one on either side of the room. Mika, the oldest, was on the left side, and Jamie, who was a year younger, was on the right. I saw Mika first, sleeping soundly and wrapped in his sheets. But when I turned to Jamie, I almost threw up. His sheets had been thrown off the bed, and he was sprawled out across his mattress in an unnaturally rigid pose. His limbs were bent back in ways that no bones should be able to move, and his unseeing eyes were open and stared up at the ceiling. Blood covered his pillow, his mattress, everything. Attached to his neck was the most hideous thing I'd ever seen. It was like a cross between a leech and a slug, and was easily almost 2 feet long and almost a fourth of that in width. The thing was latched to his neck. It was smooth and slimy and dark green, almost the exact same colour of a Christmas pine. But as I stared at it for a moment, I realised it wasn't attached to his neck. It was in his neck. The creature had torn open Jamie's throat and burrowed its head into the exposed wound. As I stared in horror, I saw the thing pulse and writhe as it fed off my dead son's blood, and God knows what else. For a cursed minute, I couldn't move. I couldn't even look away. I stared on in frozen horror before I finally tore myself away and stumbled back into the hallway. I knew Jamie was dead without having to check, and I knew that I had to call the police. But I think I was going into shock, because all I could think of in the moment was to stagger into the living room to inspect the present. It was then that I saw that the box was logged through with blood, and the top of the box had been ripped off by the creature that was held inside. There was something in there that I couldn't make out, which the police later identified as a dismembered hand, most likely put there to feed the creature once the box had been sealed. Yet when I bent down to inspect the box, I saw a small scrap of white paper that was perfectly unstained by the blood. I picked it up with shaky hands, and I was barely able to make out the words written on it in impeccable cursive. This is the gift that awaits everyone on the naughty list. Let it be a warning to you all. Cole is hungry, and he will feed. Merry Christmas.